Happy Thursday. My name is Kylie Stam. I am the Diversity Program Manager for the Elliott School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Thank you for joining us today for our Diverse Perspectives in International Affairs series, and welcome back if you've joined us before. Today's session, History and Prospects for Black Leaders in a Racialized State, is part of GW's school-wide Black Heritage Celebration. I want to take a moment to extend thanks to our colleagues in Leadership Ethics and Practice Initiative, or LEAP, for co-sponsoring this event with us today, and to all of you for supporting us and being here. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to recognize that though we are gathered virtually today, our institution resides on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples, who served as stewards of the region for generations. I hope we'll be able to gather together on campus in person safely soon. But for now, we're here virtually still, so I do want to remind folks of a few housekeeping items. This event is webinar style, which means that our panelists will not be able to see or hear you as an attendee. However, if you have questions today, which we hope that you do, we ask that you submit them through the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to address what we can during the session at the end. Our event is also being recorded, and it will be shared on our Diversity and Inclusion events page at elliott.gwu.edu/events, and I'll share that in the chat. Now, I'm excited to introduce you all to our moderator for today, Taylor Jack. Taylor is a senior associate at Chemonics International in the East and Southern Africa Division. Taylor is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer, a recent graduate of the Elliott School's International Development Studies MA program, and a public speaker on diversity and international development. She is a BA in political science from Howard University and is also co-author of Giants Who Blazed the Trail, African Americans in Foreign Policy, along with Aaron Williams, former Peace Corps director, former Elliott School board member, and LEAP Advisory Council member, and Dr. Jennifer Brinkerhoff, professor of public administration and international affairs. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today and for moderating this session. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Kylie, so much for that warm welcome. And it's always good to be back at GW, even if it is virtually. As Kylie mentioned, my name is Taylor Jack, and I'm an alumna of the International Development Studies program. Before we get started, I would like to give a special thanks for Dean Ayers for attending today's event. She has recently joined the Elliott School family, and we know that she will be raising us high as we move forward in the next chapter of the Elliott School. I have the pleasure today to moderate a discussion on what I believe to be a critical issue that we must solve as international affairs practitioners to truly be able to say that U.S. foreign policy represents the face of America. Today's topic of discussion, African American leaders in American foreign policy, history and prospects for overcoming a racialized bureaucracy, unpacks the history of African Americans in the U.S. Foreign Service and the systemic hurdles that they have faced to achieve upward mobility. Dr. Jennifer Brinkerhoff, professor of public administration, and international affairs, will be walking us through her research, highlighting areas in which the State Department has fallen short to promote, retain, and attract African American talent to the Foreign Service. We also have the pleasure today to have to join us in this discussion, two former Foreign Service officers to provide their unique perspective in response to Dr. Brinkerhoff's research. Ambassador Edward Skip Ghanim, a former decorated U.S. diplomat, former Director General of the Foreign Service, and currently the endowed Kuwait Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs at the Elliott School. Joining him will be Chris Richardson, who is also a former U.S. diplomat and is an immigration attorney and currently the general counsel and COO of W.E.B Solutions. In June 2020, Mr. Richardson published a thought-provoking op-ed in the New York Times entitled "The State Department Was Designed to Keep African Americans Out," which sparked much needed conversation within the U.S. foreign policy community about the absence of African Americans throughout the Foreign Service. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jennifer Brinkerhoff to present her research now and to get us started in this very enriching conversation.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And first of all, I just want to say this is an amazing time to be having this conversation, and I appreciate so much that so many people were interested and willing to contribute to today's event, and to all of those who are attending. And I see already in the attendee list that we have some of the people that we have talked to for our broader project on African Americans and American foreign policy, for which Taylor Jack is a co-principal investigator along with Aaron Williams. So thank you all so much for being here today. let me share my slides. Oh, hold on. Always glitches here. Here we go. Okay. Can you all see that? We're good? Okay. Okay, so this project is kind of an outgrowth of that other project that I just mentioned that I'm working with Taylor Jack and Aaron Williams on, which is a project to really try to mine the wisdom and experience of the giants who have gone before, African Americans who have served in American foreign policy, to try to support the next generation to their success in American foreign policy and representing the full measure of our society overseas and at home. So it's really a privilege to be part of that project and to share this other research with you today on the history. I also saw that Professor Michael Kren has joined us today, and he has been an invaluable person that I have talked to on numerous occasions about this research. He is an historian by training. I am not. So it's been a great privilege to be able to consult with him, and I thank and acknowledge his contributions today as well. So this particular research is really trying to address two questions. What is the historical evolution of representativeness in the State Department bureaucracy? And secondly, and very importantly, what will it take to move us closer in American foreign policy in our apparatus so that it truly reflects our country and our society? I explore these questions using data on African American leadership in the Foreign Service, ambassadorial appointments to be specific. So first, why should we even care about this? Well, I think that we've learned in our recent history how important this topic is for our international legitimacy. We also want to incorporate racial equality into our foreign policy. And many people don't realize that early advocacy efforts, for example, by the NAACP regarding representation in the State Department was about trying to promote racial equality globally, internationally, not just in the United States. Most importantly, we really need to think about what will make our foreign policy more impactful, more effective. We cannot be effective if we don't have access to the full measure of the talent that is available in our country, and also the diverse perspectives that we know through research can contribute to much better decision-making and responsiveness. So this is why we need to be concerned, right? So as I mentioned, I am going to be promoting some data on this. I am drawing significantly from the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and this was such a wonderful find, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of this with you. I want to honor an important social science pioneer through this research, and I also want to demonstrate how impactful data visualization can be. And W.E.B. Du Bois was a pioneer in this, and many people don't realize that he pioneered these approaches that have now become much more commonplace today, but he's never gotten his due credit. So each of the data visualizations I will be presenting to you today draws from a plate that W.E.B. Du Bois created for the 1900 World's Fair when he helped to organize an exhibition on the Negro in America. So I'll briefly talk about what the data shows, and in the process of doing that, provide an overview of previous efforts to try to redress this unrepresentation. And then we'll talk about future prospects. And for that, I really strongly, I'm so excited to welcome the perspectives of our discussants today, Ambassador Skip Ganim and Chris Richardson. So first of all, when we think of representativeness in our bureaucracy, we often think about what is the percentage of a particular demographic group and how, of our society as a whole, and how does that coincide with representation within a bureaucracy? So the yellow bars are the percentage of African Americans of the US population according to census data for each of these decades on average. The black bars is the percentage of posts that are filled by African Americans by decade. So we can see here that we were on a fairly positive trajectory moving close, And then in more recent years, we had a setback. But it's very clear that we have never reached a close proximity to the percentage of African Americans in our population who fill the posts within the State Department. This graphic shows the number of person years of ambassadorial service. Person years represents the number of African Americans serving in ambassadorial posts in a given year. And this is just to show the very small proportion of Black ambassadors who have served in person years compared to all other ambassadors of different demographic groups. This particular graphic shows the discrimination that occurs in terms of geographical posts. The State Department has a very long history of relegating African Americans to posts that are primarily in Africa and to a lesser extent, small island states. And so we see this here again in person years. And I love the impact of this particular data visualization. Again, this is drawn from W.E.B. Du Bois, where you see what looks like a standard bar chart and how many revolutions we need to get to demonstrate the person years of service within Africa, 451. So this is the most complicated data visualization, and I recognize it may be difficult for you to see, so I'll walk you through it. And just so that you know, the red bars are career foreign service, the blue bars are political appointees. Here on the vertical axis, we have the various administrations. So the paper that I wrote, it illustrates key moments that represent impactful factors in promoting greater diversity within the State Department bureaucracy. Those factors include milestone legislation and lawsuits, the ascension of African Americans into positions of influential authority, and emerging pressures external to the State Department bureaucracy. So I'm going to provide examples of the impact of each of these and point out where we may see their impact on this data visualization. So first I'll start with lawsuits. The Allison Palmer class action suit was introduced in 1989. And you can see 1989 is right here at the beginning of the George H. Walker Bush administration. Subsequently, we can see the first appointments of career foreign service female African-American ambassadors right here, okay? The George H. Walker Bush administration, 1989 to 1992, appointed 7 such ambassadors. We see also a significant increase in the number of career foreign service African-American ambassadors of both genders, starting in the Clinton administration, 1993 to 2000. That's this bar right here. This is perhaps following the 1996 settlement of the Thomas versus Christopher class action suit, which was specific to African-Americans. Over the history so far, I emphasize so far in the State Department, we have had 5 African-American directors general and 2 secretaries of state who have made diversity a priority. President H.W. Bush appointed the first African-American director general, Edward Perkins, in 1989. Again, we see that right here. Coinciding with the launch of the Palmer suit and 3 years after the filing of the Thomas suit. Ambassador Perkins supported the candidacy of the first female African-American ambassadors, 2 in the same year, as well as 5 male African-American ambassadors. So we also have seen throughout the history other important champions. For example, pipeline programs to try to recruit more African-Americans into foreign policy were introduced in the 1960s. We know these today as the Pickering and Rangel Fellowships. One might attribute at least part of the significant increase in African-American career foreign service ambassadors during Nixon's administration in 1969 to 1974, right here, to these earlier efforts that were introduced and championed during the Kennedy administration. Some of that programming would not have been possible without pressure and support from the Congressional Black Caucus and its members, and the House and Senate committees related to foreign affairs. Members have repeatedly called for investigations and commissioned reports. Senator Bob Menendez, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Ben Cardin were co-requesters of the most recent GAO report in 2020 on diversity in the State Department. And Senator Joaquin Castro and others introduced the Diversity and Inclusion Act for the Department of State in December of 2020. Secretary Blinken just announced, I'm so excited about this news, he just announced the creation of one component of that legislation, a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. And this legislation is being championed by a range of civil society organizations. In the early history, lobbying by civil society organizations such as the NAACP were and continue to be very important to promoting diversity within our foreign policy apparatus. So where are we now? The State Department, as we know, is still not representative of American society. Excuse me. African Americans still predominantly serve in Africa and to a lesser extent, small island states. Legal frameworks and formal rules to support diversity have been introduced, as well as organizational rules and processes to ensure equity and fairness and to promote intentional recruitment efforts. At the same time, we've seen a history of fickle commitment. And we see that, for example, in the year-to-year and sometimes absent funding of some of the pipeline programming that I mentioned before. So you may have wondered what I was going to talk about when I said racialized organization, that the State Department is a racialized organization. So I just want to quickly introduce these three important points of the theory of racialized organization. This is not my theoretical framework. This comes from a sociologist named Ray. And I just find it incredibly impactful and very helpful in explaining the dynamics that I observed through this data and through the many interviews that we have conducted with Taylor and Aaron Williams. So first of all, the theory states that racialized schemas, the way we make sense of the world, lead to racial definitions of what competence is and what is appropriate. These become operating norms. Those norms inform the distribution of jobs and also stereotype reinforcing performance reviews, which set disadvantaged groups onto an unproductive trajectory. Finally, position determines influence over organizational processes, resources, including one's own time. So if you are relegated to somebody who is not perceived to be competent or appropriate, then you don't get the best jobs, you don't get the best performance reviews, and you will never attain the positions where you might have influence over the bureaucracy. On the other hand, if you are able to attain those positions of influence, you have an opportunity to influence, in turn, those operating norms and the diversity agenda within the bureaucracy. So what's missing from the history? And well, first of all, we see the relevance of the theory of racialized organizations at play here. But I want to talk more specifically about the norms and the importance of those norms. It's important to recognize that key actors may not believe that there are sustained consequences for not complying with diversity imperatives. So if we have operating norms that say that diversity is not important, if there are no consequences for not promoting diversity, it simply will not happen, right? The context may not emphasize the importance of these norms and the consequences for compliance. On the other hand, if you think about it, if the context is showing us that there's some change that leads some people to believe that diversity is important, and we can all hope that the past spring and summer, right up until today, has really created such change. If we now believe diversity is important, then some people may change their behavior. That behavior may be observed by others, and therefore, if they see that that change of behavior is either encouraged and rewarded, or at least not interfered with, increasing numbers of people may also adopt those norms. So we need to focus on norms. We need to focus on leadership that reinforces the importance of those norms and provides some teeth to the consequences of not complying with those norms. And we need to still pay attention to these broader networks of institutional entrepreneurs, those who will work together to ensure that we continue to make progress. So where do we go from here? As I already implied, we need some of the same components that we have witnessed in some of the promising moments in history, which includes active, proactive involvement and championing of this agenda. It includes networks of actors, both internal to the bureaucracy, but very importantly, also those who are external to the bureaucracy. And that includes powerful figures such as those in Congress, but also civil society organizations who can, through those networks, bring a variety of resources to bear on this agenda. We need the sustained presence of institutional entrepreneurs who are always looking at strategies for how best to promote and sustain this agenda. And we need to pay attention to the normative frameworks that are at play and not just to the structures that we create. And that's where I want to end, just by emphasizing that while power is important to be sure, and those structures and laws and frameworks are essential to progress, they alone will not help us to get to a more representative foreign policy. We have to pay attention to norms and supporting each other in what is acceptable behavior, what is desirable behavior, and what is the vision that we all share for what our foreign policy apparatus should look like. So we have to pay attention to norms too. I just want to end with this image. I love this image. I want to leave you with this. This is what US ambassadors look like in our foreign policy. Thank you very much. And I very much look forward to the remarks from Ambassador Ghanim and Chris Richardson. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that wonderful presentation. I will now hand it over to Ambassador Ghanim to provide his remarks in response to this research. Skip, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Taylor. And I want to thank Jennifer and her colleagues very much for the very extensive research that was done in the earlier study, but that formed a lot of basis for what you have presented today. It was extremely well done research. I have to begin by that, and very, very compelling data. I think the paper dramatically documents a very severe problem in the State Department, and there's just no doubt about it. And the only comment I can make, and again, I was Director General of the Foreign Service from 1997 to 2000, so that's really 20 plus years ago. There was already a lot of focus on this, and there's been far more in recent years, as is really justifiable. There's been some success, which I'll mention a little bit later, but it's still woefully inadequate to deal with the problem. I think the paper did note, and you made these in your introductory remarks, Jennifer, that it's important that we have good processes in place, but that doesn't necessarily produce what you claim is the objective. And I think that's equally true of exalted rhetoric. It's great to have it, but that doesn't really necessarily produce what you're after. A good example of the former is that some years ago, we required that there be in a officer's performance description. And one of the items that they were to be judged for promotion was their support for diversity and their support for minorities under their guidance, their supervision. I know from reading lots of reports, there were boilerplate languages that officers used to describe how the person they were rating had done that. and it was really inconsequential. So it's just a really good example of how just because you have a process, just because you put some requirement into a work program, doesn't mean that you bring it back. I would make just two observations, if I might. One is on the statistics, and particularly that chart that you had of the presidents. I take a little issue with putting together the 1940s, 50s, and even the 60s, and also the last 4 years, by the way, when trying to draw a broader conclusion, because I really do focus a lot on the Clinton, Bush 43, and the Obama administrations. I mean, those are dramatically better figures. Again, as you pointed out, not where they should be, but I think that they are more illustrative of where we have been, where we are going, is what I should have said. And not the last 4 years, which I think doesn't deserve any further comment. The second that I would say was that the report correctly states, and it documents well, the fact that a huge percent of Black officers are assigned to African posts. I would only just add this additional observation. I don't have the exact figures, but I know there are roughly 190 countries in the United Nations, and there are a few more ambassadorial assignments to international organizations. But if you figure it's 200 plus total, and you realize that about 30% on the average of most years, those three presidents I mentioned for sure, go to political appointees, then the number left for the Foreign Service, a career, is going to be significant less, at roughly 130. Of the 130, let me just point out that 54 of the countries are in Africa. So there's a whopping large number of posts available for career. Why? Because the political appointees go to Europe, the political appointees go to Canada, Mexico, and major allies in Asia like Japan, Korea, China, of course, Australia, and that further reduces the number of posts that career people get, and that means for minorities and African Americans as well. I only just point that out as I think that, but it's still, you're right, that graphic is dramatic, and it is a problem. I can attest to that myself when we were looking to make assignments to ambassadorial positions when I was Director General. I think there has been some progress. You mentioned the Pickering and the Rangel fellowships. I just want to point out that when I was nominated to be Director General, which would have been in '97, the Justice Department had abolished all of the minority hire programs in the federal government as being discriminatory against others. So that when I came in, I made a commitment that I was going to find a way to re-establish that program or something like it. And I managed to convince lawyers at state and lawyers then at justice that if we had an intake program for the disadvantaged, that was acceptable because it could be of any race, of any creed. And I knew that it was going to be largely a minority intake program, but since I didn't call it that, it was acceptable. And that is in fact what became the Pickering fellowships, named after a very distinguished career diplomat. And then of course you did mention the Rangel fellowships supported by Congress. Thank goodness they get involved in this. And that is a major, major improvement in being able to bring in minority candidates, and particularly African Americans. So, and by the way, that was legislated, which is another issue that we might talk about in the course of today's discussion. One of the other things that happened was an intensified effort to recruit at the historic Black colleges. And that included deliberate assignments of diplomats and residents. These are diplomats who have a tour of being assigned to a university or a collective group, and we deliberately moved toward putting them in these historical Black colleges. And why? You know, this is very important because if you don't have professors and educators at an institution talking up the variety of professions, then your students are not going to look in those directions. I have to tell you, the person who introduced me to the Foreign Service was an 8th grade civics teacher. I realize that's not college, but that's where it started. And so by having a diplomat that's telling people in an audience of students or classes, look what I did, you can do this, that's an encouragement. And that's very, I think, important. But I have to admit, these initiatives take time to produce. And I think we're seeing that happening. And the only other thing to mention, since your focus, Jennifer, was very largely, and I think appropriately, on the ambassadorial level assignments. When you bring people into the Foreign Service, there are basic assignments and career progressions that build up an individual's experience to then be in that category of people to be considered for ambassadorial assignments. And so your study did make that point. We have to put minorities into jobs that lead in that direction. And that's very important. And that's really a responsibility of the Director General and the assignment process. And so I think that's very important. So I'm really not trying to make excuses for us, because the basic premise is solid and things need to be done. But I do think that beginning in the 80s that we have made some progress, and that there are now more serving, and there will be in the future more minorities, Black African Americans. But I did think I should mention just that. When you're in the department and you're a leader in the department, you're talking about minorities as a bigger group than just African Americans. But I think the study today is focused on that as is appropriate. So I don't have a problem. But again, I want to come back and say that if the processes and statements of policy are not producing, then what's needed? And it's leadership. It's absolutely the attitude of individuals who are placed in leadership. And in the State Department, you simply must recognize that the bulk of senior office holders in the State Department are political appointees. They come into the State Department from the outside. They then find a system in place. They may or may not be interested in changing it. They're probably more interested in making sure it supports them. And therefore, you've got to put people in the job that care about this issue. And you pointed out that there were at least 2 Black secretaries, and certainly they're very much proponents of this, as were the DGs that you mentioned. Establishing procedures that survive the changes at the senior level is critical. I know, because I established what I thought was a very good process for selecting ambassadors from the career service, which had a very big component in the so-called D committee, the deputy secretary's review of these jobs in place. Only when I left, and it wasn't just my successor, but other changes in leadership simply threw it out or reorganized it in such a way. So I wasn't able to institutionalize my suggestions, which again, self-promoting, I thought were reasonably good. So again, leadership is really important. And I'm glad, Jennifer, you mentioned that announcement. I had it here that they were now establishing the office, and there was hope that it will now be legislated to make it permanent. I only worry that just another office in the State Department with sort of a projected goal of doing this just becomes another bureaucratic piece of the puzzle. It's got to have some authority. Where is it going to be able to exercise influence? How about meaningful influence in the processes that we're talking about? That's not clear from an announcement in an office to be decided. Thank you.
Thanks, Skip. Now I will welcome Chris Richardson to give his comments in response to Jennifer's research.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for having me. This is a real honor to be here with the ambassador, with the professor, and with all of you really to discuss, discuss these important issues going on in today's world. It's interesting in thinking about the research and thinking about what you guys have presented. 2 things jumped out at me. One was the historical context of everything going on. And the second was the notion of a pipeline, right? So you guys start off talking about, the ambassadorships and why, why is it that we have these few African-American ambassadors at the top? And, we also talk about, well, we have all these entry programs. We have the Pickering, you had the old program in the 1960s to the Ford Foundation. And so you're wondering, well, what happens between that beginning part with the recruitment and then at the ambassadorship level where you don't have that many African Americans? And I think that what your paper really points to is that there's an issue with the pipeline, and there's an issue with the State Department itself, that is causing so many African Americans to enter the State Department but not get to the very, very end, not get to that ambassadorship level. An ambassador isn't born, they have to be made through the entire sausage making process of becoming a State Department diplomat. And I think that when we're asking, okay, so what's happening, your paper really touches on this idea that it isn't that, African Americans somehow are lesser, or it isn't somehow that African Americans aren't smart enough or whatever to become ambassadors. It's the fact that the State Department, and this is what I talked about in my New York Times article, the State Department really wasn't designed for African Americans or women or people who are different, right? And so in 1924, when they passed the first Foreign Service Act, they made the Foreign Service to be more professionalized. They really didn't think about African Americans. So when the first African American passed, Clifton Wharton Sr., what happened is that the people saw Clifton Wharton, they didn't realize he was African American. And when they found that he was African American, they were so shocked and horrified that they immediately sent him to Liberia. And Professor Michael Crenn, who's on this call, he's been my inspiration for really researching and understanding the history of the State Department. When they found out that this African American passed, they went to the President of the United States and asked him, Calvin Coolidge, they said, President Coolidge, can you pass an executive order specifically barring African Americans from joining the State Department? And when he didn't do that, when the president, to his credit, said no, the State Department for literally 20 years kept African Americans out for the oral process, the oral examination process. And in the 1950s and 60s, you saw this process where they were really upset by this idea of having to expand the State Department and expand and allowing African Americans in. And so that even when the African Americans who got into the service, they found themselves opposed by the white officers when they got into the service. And so I think that that's sort of what you're seeing when you're thinking about the idea of historical context, and you're thinking about the idea of all these extra people or additional people joining the State Department. And even when you had people who were supportive in theory of African Americans joining the State Department and being in the State Department, even those people got bogged down by the ideas, right? And so Dean Rusk is somebody that is often cited as somebody that we admire and respect in the State Department. But when you read his biography, he says that, well, I tried to bring in African Americans, but I just ran into so many problems that it just wasn't worth it. And he had brought up in a really interesting story that he said that, I think his words were, African Americans were relegated to messengers and secretaries at the State Department, and white people were the Foreign Service officers and the ambassador. So his answer was to appoint more white people as messengers and secretaries in the State Department. And then Dean Rusk in this book gets mad at the Black people who are messengers and in these quote unquote lower skill jobs for not welcoming this idea. And so you see stories like that that are just like constantly in the State Department in the history. In every biography I've read of every Secretary of State and every leader in the State Department for the last 70, 80 years, those that mention race, it really is as an aside, if they mention it at all, right? Hillary Kissinger doesn't mention race in his book. George Shultz doesn't mention race in his book. None of these guys mention this issue in their biographies. And I think that that speaks to the heart of what the problem is, right? Like I read George Packer's book on Richard Holbrooke, and that was 700 pages. And you would think that Black people didn't exist. You would think that this issue didn't exist. You would think that, and that's been the history of the State Department, is that this issue is very much ancillary, it is very much secondary, and it's something that they put and they try to deal with on a level of, okay, so the water heater doesn't work in the building, we don't have Black people, it's like this third or fourth tier issue, and that's the way they treat it. So if you treat the issue of diversity and race as a secondary, third, fourth, fifth issue, and you give it to a committee and to a task force, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have this process and this result. And I think that that's what we're seeing the results of. What I really liked in your paper was this idea of institutional entrepreneurs. We've seen them make a difference at the State Department. So Edward Dudley, who was the first ambassador, the first full-ranked ambassador, he really worked to break what was known as the Negro Circuit, where African Americans were forced to go to 4 or 5 countries, basically their entire career. He worked on that. Chester Bowles, the former ambassador to India, these people worked daily on this issue of diversity. They kept bringing it up, bringing it up, and bringing it up until they actually saw change. And I think that that's what you're going to need to see to make any kind of long-term changes in the State Department. And so I think that what you brought up about institutional entrepreneurship was really, really important. But we really have to focus on that pipeline. And it can't be that, hey, we're going to have like a bunch of Pickering programs, we're going to have a bunch of things that recruit people in. That's great. What we really have to do is ask ourselves, well, how do we keep them? How do we make sure that they're supported and nurtured and mentored so that one day they can be ambassadors, right? So that's where the big issue, I think, is at the State Department. And for many people at the State Department, they don't see it as an issue because you're really dealing with this notion of a bureaucratic ideology, as Professor Kryn says. The way I got into this issue was actually because I was doing research for a book I was writing while as a diplomat on the civil rights movement. And whenever the State Department came up in the process of researching, it was fascinating how the State Department was never seen as good, right? So when Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize, the State Department, through London's embassy and the embassy in Oslo, basically didn't support him. They said, no, we're not going to help him. He was the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The State Department chose not to help in the 1960s. Stories like that shocked me. But as time went on, I just sort of figured out that the problem is that you have a very bureaucratic system, you have an up and out system where people really have to protect and hold on to their jobs. And they don't want to make uncomfortable decisions and things that might hurt them in that process. And so I think that your point about institutional entrepreneurship, that's what it's going to take. And as the ambassador said, it can't be just assigning someone this role, because the bureaucracy is going to find a way to block anyone who's a chief diversity officer unless that person has real support from leadership, and unless that person is willing to basically break some eggs or break some shells or whatever that phrase is to make a difference and to make change. And so I'm going to stop right there so we can open it up for questions. But I really do thank you for this research, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak and to be here with you guys today.
Thank you, Chris. Looking at the time, we have about 15 minutes left for questions. And I kind of want to frame, as we start off our Q&A session, frame this in a way that this research is supposed to inform our decisions that we're moving forward, especially as the Foreign Service is changing. We have a whole new generation of young leaders that are coming in that are demanding change. They are no longer allowing the status quo to be the norm anymore. And if the State Department does not change, we will see this mass exodus of talent leaving that is a detriment to our Foreign Service. And Chris Richardson is a product of that. So as we start off our first question, and I chuckle a little bit because I've heard of the corridor effect many, many times. And this question is for both Skip and Chris. Can you speak about the corridor effect and the fact that almost everyone is told that your reputation at the State Department is so important that sometimes it's best to keep your head down? I heard the affinity groups at State had a survey that noted a lot of people did not want to speak of misconduct because of the whispers that would ruin their career or next post.
Well, I can start on this and let Chris, because he's been in the service a little bit more recently than I have, and at a level it's really important in career development. But I would say that corridor reputation is everything. I hate to say it because the law says promotions, job assignments have to be made on performance as documented in the file and not anything else. But the truth of the matter is, everyone who enters the Foreign Service starts to get a reputation pretty quickly. And that is the word of mouth that is passed on when people are looking for assignments. So I'm in a post, I'm the ambassador, and I have to fill in for a new administrative counselor, for example. And I have a list of names of people who either have bid for it or that I'm interested in. So who do? I call my colleagues who've served with them to find out how they are. And when I hear, oh, they're great, then, they're in my A category. So, the truth of the matter is that the corridor reputation is important. Now, does it mean keeping your head down? I think there's a big element of that, and that's often discussed and talked about within the service, that people are try not to make big waves and therefore are not challenging different things, whether it be policy or structure or attitudes. You don't want to be seen as a dissident, because that's what your label would come back. And so I do think that is a serious issue that has to be dealt with. That's not going to be handled by paper, frankly.
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I totally agree with the ambassador. Corridor reputation means everything. I did a presentation recently for the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, and a junior officer actually asked me that question. They're like, "Well," it was a white female officer, and she asked me. She said, "Well, if my corridor reputation, let's say I see racism against a black officer, but I'm afraid to speak up because it might hurt my corridor reputation." And I said, any organization where your corridor reputation must be based in you supporting, endorsing, or looking or turning a side eye to racism, you shouldn't be in it at the end of the day. And that's the attitude we have to have, unfortunately. And I think, unfortunately, it's a really big thing in the State Department that you have to go along and get along. And look, if you are the type of person who's going to see something and speak out and you feel like you have to do that, it's not necessarily clear that the State Department necessarily is the place for you. But I do think, though, that, like the paper says, you have to have people like Ambassador Thomas. You have to have people like just who really fought for this, doing it in their own way. And that's kind of the only way, unfortunately, we're going to change the State Department. What I tell people is that if you want to go and throw over the tables like Jesus did, the State Department isn't the place for you. It's not the place to be throwing over tables. You have to do it in a certain way that allows you to not burn too many bridges, but also be able to maintain that corridor reputation, because corridor reputation does mean everything. And maybe it shouldn't. And I think that's a question that we really need to ask ourselves. There's so many things in the State Department that are very sacrosanct that we really need to ask ourselves the tough questions, even down to whether the Foreign Service exam is really our best way to produce the best people in our country, and also whether like Facebook and Google don't use corridor reputation the way the State Department does. The companies that we look up to in the United States as being the best and the brightest, they don't do that corridor reputation stuff anymore, because that can be a very much a blanket for racism, and very much a blanket way of keeping people out or keeping people down, and also discouraging people from staying in the service. And so I think that, yes, the corridor reputation is very, very important. But I also think it's something that we, both those of us who left and those of us who are still in there, we really should ask the tough questions about whether it shouldn't matter as much as it does.
Thanks, Chris and Skip. To your point about the Foreign Service exam, we all know that standardized testing disproportionately affects brown and black people more so than our white colleagues. To your knowledge, have there been any research been done on the effect of the Foreign Service exams? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. Okay, so we can move on.
As far as I know, no. And I think that this goes back to this issue about the Pickering and Wrangles, which I love those programs, but those people, the people who get the Pickering and Wrangle program are looked down upon at State Department. Like, again, it goes back to that corridor reputation thing where they look at you, and I've heard lots of white officers will ask me that when I was in the State Department, like, you're not a Pickering or a Wrangle, are you? And that's the kind of attitude that they have. And I would be like, it doesn't matter if I'm a Pickering or a Wrangle, I'm a diplomat just like you. And you should respect that. But the minute you would snap back with that answer, it became, oh, well, Chris, he might be, yeah, you don't get along too well with him because he challenges stuff like that, and that's just not Chris talking. That's people who've won the Pickering and Wrangle will tell you that they felt very much that the State Department looked down upon them because that test, again, is so sacrosanct. I was not a Pickering or Wrangle fellow, and maybe we should look at ways to increase or broaden our diversity pipelines. But again, that retention component is something that we really can't turn away from. And I think that that's a really important part of state, that state doesn't necessarily.
I'm sorry, Chris, are you finished? Yeah, I agree with Chris. It's really deplorable, but there is this attitudinal issue to those who don't come through the regular exam process, and that's a really serious stereotyping issue within the Foreign Service, because the people that we bring in through those programs are dynamic. They are extraordinarily good, and this is an avenue for bringing people in who represent America, frankly. And I'm very supportive of those programs. And I don't know how we actually address that discrimination. There have been some efforts to adjust the exam. I'm just not current enough to be specific. I know there was another part of the step put in where there were narratives, questions, which people were allowed to describe their leadership roles and whatever. That was to give a committee more knowledge of an individual's personality and an engagement, which the old system without it had not done. I have some questions about that because I can see that being discriminatory. 5 people looking at a file deciding whether the person, they don't know about race or anything of that sort, but still, again, it comes down to a judgmental factor, but it does provide a little more insight into an individual who's applying for the Foreign Service.
Thanks, Skip. Moving on to the next question, I believe that everyone on this call knows that retention is a huge issue within the State Department, and GAO released a report last February on the diversity efforts of the State Department and its current standings. That report suggested that the total numbers of minorities and women were increasing in the department. However, the numbers of senior level positions were at best stagnant. Any comments on that recent report? I know in our pre-discussions, we talked about a new report that's coming out on additional research on diversity in the State Department. Any thoughts on that you can kind of give us insight into?
If I can just start by saying that this is one of the really, really important components of this theory of racialized organizations, that those operating norms influence how those performance reviews happen, which then affects whether or not somebody can make progress towards leadership positions. And so it's the core of this research, it's the core of the problem. And I would invite Skip to maybe share a little bit about what those processes look like from the inside, because you're uniquely positioned to be able to share what it looked like, at least on your watch, and how those operating norms interfere with those retention and promotion efforts.
Well, clearly we're talking about the assignment cycle, and then we're also talking about, if you want to go to the ambassadorial level, we're talking about the process of how you select it. And again, my experience when I was Director General was to try to make that far more transparent than it had been before. The historical way it's done is the list of potential openings for the next summer, next cycle comes out. The geographic bureaus always have their candidate that they want to see get the job. And if there isn't something in the system that forces a broadening of that list, then that's what goes forward. And that's based on lots of the things that Chris was saying, the corridor reputations, whether you got the jobs and whatever else. So what I established was that I went out with a cable to all of the senior officers with the list of upcoming ambassadorial positions for the following year. I also then asked my career development officers, the counselors, to search their database and give me recommendations. And I got the bureaus, and I insisted on getting more than one name. So I would then look at that larger list and come up with a shorter list of the best 6, 7, or 8 candidates. That list I presented then to the D committee. This deputy secretary has a committee that includes some of the senior officials of the department, where we would look at the list of countries we were focusing on, say the 10 African countries. And we would go through, with me presenting the names for each one, we would select the one we thought was best to advance to the secretary, who in turn would advance the name to the White House. At the end of looking at the 10, I always required us, or someone else did, because this was our approach, to go back and look who we picked. and I'm going to be dramatic, if it was 9 whites and 1 non-white, that wasn't sufficient. If there were 8 males and only 2 females, that wasn't right. We went back then and looked at what we had decided to try to balance out the ethnicity and also the male and female ratio, so that we came up with some sort of an input to the secretary. The secretary rarely changed the recommendation of the committee, but unless that is part of the process and that broader list is not created, then you're not going to have in that pool the diversity that you need and that we're looking for. Jennifer, is that what you were thinking about? Okay.
In the interest of time, I just have one more question, and it kind of goes into something that you were saying, Skip. And I just want to thank you for your efforts that you made as Director General. Since that time, there has never been a Director General that has served more than 3 years. You had the longest serving term in the recent history of Director Generals, and that matters. Consistency and continuity matters. As Jennifer mentioned earlier, Secretary Blinken has announced this new diversity chief officer at the State Department. And while that's a step in the right direction, we all know that having legislation that codifies and mandates that departments throughout the federal government work on a certain initiative and have deliverables is the best way to see Jennifer's research make a full turn and we have more diversification in the State Department. In your opinion, both you and Chris, what do you think can be done with the executive order that President Biden put out on his inauguration day, advancing racial equality and support for underserved communities through the federal government? What do you think is in the power of the Secretary of State as well as Director General to make this a reality?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the point about longevity, because it was one that was in my mind constantly as I looked at this report. Because again, with my own experience, I was Director General for 3 years. And as you said, Taylor, I don't think any successor, and I went out in 2000, so we're talking about 21 years, has served 3 years less. And in my own experience, and I think this would be certainly validated by almost anyone you asked, in the first year that you're in a position like Director General, there's so much you need to learn and so much already in train, so that you then begin to think about what you want to change. And that's the year that you begin to think about it. And in your second year, you introduce it. If you're there for a third year, you can actually institutionalize it. And if you're in there less, it seems to pass out. It just seems to go away. I remember several initiatives that I took that people were really opposed to. And I said, all right, I'm going to do it for a 1-year pilot project. If at the end of the year, we'll get together. If you don't like it, it's out. Well, by the time I get a year into it, and I said, let's evaluate it, people said, but why are we changing? This has worked. And I said, okay, it was in my mind psychologically from the very beginning. So what do you need to do? Somehow one needs to be far more precise in the selection process for the ambassadorials. Again, I'm talking about that level, and put it into some systematized regulation within the department that can survive a change in leadership. That's what I referred to earlier. The only problem with that is that it's not law. It's more in the ken of an executive order. It's a secretarial order. So it can be changed in the future. And that's a real problem. Sorry, I'm talking a bit too long, but as you talked about this new office, I remember, and I was DG when they created this office on religious freedom. And it was mandated by law. It was created with objectives, and you talked about it, with accountabilities, including a report. You know what? It got sidetracked. If the secretary and the institution doesn't care about the work of that office, they produce this report every year, and it hasn't really changed much at all. So again, it's back of focus and leadership. Sorry, I just can't get away from that particular focus.
Yeah, all I can say, just to add to everything, the excellent comments from the ambassador, is that, I would, whoever he decides to pick for this chief diversity officer, the first thing they need to do is go talk to the office of the historian and go read 70 years worth of congressional investigations, internal reports, GAO. There have been so many reports written about the State Department to improve the State Department. And yet here we are. An executive order and pushing from even the White House isn't going to change them. President Kennedy, as Professor Kern pointed out, he called them all in and said, hey, you guys need to diversify the State Department. And the State Department was like, yeah, we'll get right on that. And that's always the answer. It's like, yeah, we'll get right on that. And it's been 70 years worth of, we're going to get right on it. And so it really has to be, change is only going to come from the State Department people themselves, to the extent that you can do it without lawsuits. And that is going to be the biggest challenge, because like it has to be something that's both self-sustaining and pushing. And you have to have people in there who are not afraid to hurt feelings, and people in there who realize they only have a short amount of time. You got 4 years to do this, probably a little bit less. And you have to assume that the next president is going to undo everything you've done. And so you have to find a way to make this happen in a very short period of time. And so I think that that's the attitude that whoever is going to take over this job, they need to have. But we also have to have that historical context. I think that people jump into these things thinking that they're the first person to ever think about this and the first people to ever research this issue, when in fact they're not. This issue has been talked about and almost talked to death about since the 1940s. And so I think you have to have that mindset and that context in place before we can do anything, anything else.
I know we're short on time, but I would just like to add one more thing. Clearly, there are a lot of people here today because you care about this issue. And in as much as what Chris and Skip were saying about the importance of leadership and actors on the inside, all of that is absolutely important. But we also need to sustain the external pressure. And so I hope that all of those of you who are in attendance, and especially if you're part of broader networks and organizations, that you would continue to work to put pressure on Congress to enact this legislation that Representative Castro and others have introduced, but also just to keep the pressure on to actually see real results from this. I did notice in the chat there was a question about other people of color, and I would like to just quickly say something about that. This particular research was focused only on African Americans. And one of the things that I discovered in the research is there are significant limitations to data for justice. The only reason I was able to compile all of this data is because there were champions for this data. Organizations like blackpast.org and other interest groups from the American Foreign Service Association and others, they collected this data, and then I could corroborate it with the Office of the Historian. But the Office of the Historian doesn't collect this demographic specific data. So there aren't similar champions for data, for example, on Latinx populations within the State Department, and their representation is so far behind. I mean, it's just, African Americans are making more progress than that, and we've just heard how dismal that progress is. So, so I encourage everybody to stay engaged on these issues, and thank you all so much for coming.
Well, I would like to officially close and say thank you all for hanging in there with us, especially as we've gone over time. I would like to give a special thanks to Dr. Brinkerhoff, Ambassador Ganim, and Mr. Richardson for their time today. And my last comments is really for the students on the call and those who are not. This is your State Department to take over. Please push forward, continue to make this an issue, and know the change is not going to come overnight. We will see the fruit of our labor in due time. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.